At exactly 2:11 a.m., while most of America slept, a quiet update appeared on a public court website. No press conference. No flashing lights. No announcement. Just a legal filing, buried deep inside a civil case most people had never heard of. But for survivors of Catholic Church abuse, that single upload meant something terrifying. The truth was no longer fully under control. Because somewhere inside that filing was confirmation of something they had been saying for decades. Not that abuse happened. Everyone knows that now. But that someone knew, and chose silence anyway. The courthouse in New Jersey didn't look like the center of a national reckoning. It was dull. Fluorescent. Almost lifeless. A security guard sipped cold coffee. A janitor pushed a mop down an empty hallway. And in a parking lot across the street, investigative producer Maya Ortiz sat in her car refreshing a government website like it was a pulse monitor. She had been watching this case for months. Not because it was flashy. Not because it involved a celebrity. But because survivors kept telling her the same thing. If that report ever comes out, everything changes. Maya didn't come from money. She didn't come from power. She came from pattern recognition. And the pattern surrounding Catholic Church abuse cases was painfully familiar. A survivor comes forward. An internal review is promised. The institution claims it found nothing. Time passes. The survivor is told it's too late. But this case was different. Because this time, there was proof that an internal report existed. A report that had allegedly been withheld, delayed, or buried during discovery. A report that courts were now asking uncomfortable questions about. And when Maya saw the update appear on the docket, her stomach tightened. Because institutions don't fight this hard over documents unless the documents matter. She called her editor. It moved, she said quietly. Moved how? He asked. They acknowledged the report. And the judge isn't buying the privilege excuse anymore. There was silence on the line. Then, does that mean? Maya finished the thought for him. It means someone wrote down what they knew. For survivors, that sentence alone was radioactive. Because for years they were told. There was no record. There was no proof. There was no way to know. But if a report existed, then knowledge existed. And if knowledge existed, then silence wasn't an accident. Abuse is the first crime. What comes after, the denial, the deflection, the quiet reassignments, that's the second. Survivors often describe it as worse. Not because the abuse stopped hurting, but because being erased hurts longer. Maya had spoken to dozens of survivors while researching this story. Different states, different decades, different parishes, same emotional scar. They didn't expect justice. They just wanted someone to admit. We knew you were telling the truth. One survivor, whose name Maya would never use, told her something she couldn't shake. They didn't just protect him. They protected the idea of the church. That idea, that the institution itself was sacred, untouchable, became the shield. And anyone who threatened it became disposa. The report at the center of the 2025 court battle wasn't new. It wasn't written yesterday. It had existed for years, commissioned internally, protected legally, and rarely acknowledged publicly. Institutions call this risk management. Survivors call it burying bodies without graves. Maya knew better than to assume what the report said. But she knew exactly what its existence implied. Timelines, complaints, decisions, names, and above all, intent. It began with a complaint, written down, signed, and handed to the church itself. And that's what makes everything that followed impossible to deny. In the fall of 1997, a handwritten letter arrived at a diocesan office in the Midwest. No lawyer. No media. No threat. Just a survivor doing what every institution says it wants. Coming forward. The letter described abuse by a priest. Specific dates. Specific locations. Specific behaviors. It wasn't vague. It wasn't emotional rambling. It was careful. Measured. Almost apologetic. The writer even asked, politely, if the church could look into it. That letter was logged, stamped, filed, and never shared outside the building. Internally, the response followed a familiar path. A quiet meeting. A note in a confidential file. A conversation framed as pastoral concern. No police report. No mandatory reporting, despite state laws already requiring it in certain cases. Instead, the matter was classified as non-public. Which, in church language, meant one thing. Control the damage. 6 months later, another letter arrived. Different handwriting. Different parish. Same priest. This time the survivor was younger. The details were even more explicit. And this time there was fear in the writing. The survivor wrote, "I don't know who else to tell. I was told the church would help." That letter also stayed inside the building. According to later court filings, diocesan officials held a closed-door meeting shortly after the second complaint. No minutes were released publicly. No audio recordings existed. But a summary memo, referenced decades later, revealed the tone. The priest was described as struggling, in need of guidance. Not malicious but misguided. The victims were not described at all. Instead, the memo focused on avoiding scandal. Within months, the priest was reassigned. Not suspended. Not reported. Transferred. A new parish. A fresh start. Different children. This pattern would repeat again and again, not just in one diocese but across the country. And every transfer created something crucial: distance from the original complaint. For decades, church officials argued they lacked knowledge, that they couldn't act on rumors, that they were unaware of patterns. But the documents emerging in 2025 tell a different story. They don't show ignorance. They show containment. Because once something is written down, once it's logged, it becomes knowledge. And knowledge carries responsibility. Many survivors never wrote letters. They stayed silent, not because they forgot but because they were taught not to speak. Some were told, "You misunderstood. You tempted him. You'll destroy the church." Others were simply ignored. The silence wasn't accidental. It was cultivated. By the early 2000s, the priest at the center of these early complaints had accumulated a file thick enough to require multiple folders. Still no police involvement. Still no public acknowledgement. And still the church maintained the same line. "We handle these matters internally." What they didn't say was why. Why protect one priest over dozens of children? Why risk everything for silence? Former insiders would later explain. Because the church didn't fear lawsuits. It feared precedent. If one case became public, others would follow. And once the pattern was visible, it couldn't be unseen. This is where the narrative shifts from abuse to something darker. Because abuse is a crime of an individual. But concealment, especially when repeated, is a crime of an institution. And by the time the third complaint arrived, officials were no longer deciding what happened. They were deciding what would never be allowed to surface. But the cover-up didn't stay contained forever. Because years later, one survivor refused to stay silent. And when they finally spoke, to the wrong person, it triggered an investigation no one inside the church was prepared for. Welcome to Coziness Stories. If you enjoy calm, immersive stories like this, take a moment to subscribe and make yourself at home. The church thought the files were safe, locked away, buried under time and tradition. They never expected the threat to come from inside the building. In 2009, a mid-level diocesan administrator, someone whose job title sounded harmless, was asked to help digitize old records. The assignment was framed as routine: scan personnel files, organize archival documents, prepare storage for historical preservation. No warnings, no restrictions, just a keycard and access. What this employee found would haunt them for years. As the files were scanned, a pattern emerged. The same names appeared again and again. Priests moved abruptly. Medical leave with no diagnosis. Transfers following complaints. Handwritten notes marked confidential. In some cases, the complaints were stapled directly to transfer orders. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't negligence. It was strategy. Then came one file that didn't belong. It wasn't labeled like the others. No personnel number. No parish code. Just a thin folder with a single memo inside. The memo referenced a death. Not an allegation. Not misconduct. A death. The language was clinical, but chilling. Cause of death inconclusive. No external reporting necessary. Matter resolved pastorally. The administrator froze. Because this wasn't a church matter. This was a crime scene that never became one. When the administrator raised concerns, quietly, they were told to stop asking questions. A supervisor warned them. "These things are complicated. You don't have the full context. This isn't your role." Then came the real warning. "If this gets out, it destroys everything." Not someone. Everything. The administrator didn't run to the authorities immediately. Fear played a role. So did uncertainty. But there was something else, something survivors understand too well. They wanted proof. Because accusations alone don't survive institutions built on credibility. Documents do. Late one evening, after hours, the administrator made a decision. They copied the file. Not the original. Not the entire archive. just enough to preserve what mattered. Then they put everything back exactly as it was. No alarms. No confrontation. For now. Within weeks, subtle changes followed. Access permissions altered. Files reassigned. Staff quietly rotated. No one said the word whistleblower. But everyone felt it. The administrator's workload doubled. Meetings increased. Their performance was suddenly under review. Pressure without accusation. A classic containment move. For months, the administrator lived in silence. By day, they worked inside the system. By night, they replayed what they'd read. The memo about the death. The complaints ignored. The transfers disguised as mercy. At some point, neutrality became impossible. The administrator finally told one person. A journalist. Not a crime reporter. Not an activist. Someone known for covering local politics. Quietly, carefully. They met off the record. No recordings. No names. Just documents slid across a table. The journalist didn't ask if it was real. They asked one question. How many? The administrator didn't know. And that answer was worse. Abuse is horrific, but legally complex. Cover-ups are simpler. Once an institution knowingly conceals a crime, it becomes obstruction. It becomes conspiracy. It becomes criminal liability. And that memo? It suggested someone made a decision to keep law enforcement out. The journalist didn't publish immediately. They verified. They cross-checked. They waited. And in doing so, they triggered something no one inside the church could stop. Because once outside eyes see inside files, silence stops being protection. It becomes evidence. But before the story could break, the whistleblower was identified. And suddenly, the question wasn't about the past anymore. It was about who would survive the truth. If this story is drawing you in, subscribing to Coziness Stories helps you enjoy more tales like this every time you return. For years, the church insisted this was about abuse. Tragic. Shameful. But contained. What they never expected anyone to ask was this. Why did one of the victims die, and why was no police report ever filed? The name didn't appear in headlines. It didn't appear in press releases. It didn't even appear in most internal summaries. It appeared only once in a margin note. A single line handwritten. Deceased. Matter resolved pastorally. No age listed. No date of death. No cause. Just closure, declared by people with no legal authority to do so. Court filings years later would reveal the victim was a teenage altar server. 17. From a family deeply embedded in the parish. Weekly mass. Volunteer parents. A household that trusted the church implicitly. The teen had previously reported inappropriate behavior to a youth coordinator. That report was never forwarded to police. Instead, it was forwarded upward, to diocesan leadership. According to later witness statements, the teen was last seen alive after a late evening counseling session. Not at a hospital. Not at a public event. At a rectory. A place assumed to be safe. The official story said the death occurred days later from natural causes. No autopsy was publicly documented. In most states, unexplained deaths of minors require mandatory reporting. But this death was classified internally as non-suspicious, private family matter, handled with discretion. The family was advised not to seek outside involvement. They were told the church would take care of everything. Public scrutiny would dishonor the child. Police involvement would cause unnecessary suffering. Grief makes people vulnerable. And trust makes them compliant. The funeral happened quickly. Closed casket. Limited attendees. No press. The priest who officiated spoke of personal struggles. A fragile soul. God's mysterious timing. Nothing about allegations. Nothing about prior complaints. The narrative was sealed. Years later, when investigators reopened the file, one detail stood out. The death certificate listed a cause inconsistent with earlier medical history. No chronic illness. No documented condition. Yet the cause suggested one. Which raised a devastating possibility. The story was written to fit the paperwork, not the facts. When journalists began asking questions in 2024, diocesan officials responded carefully. They didn't deny the death. They denied knowledge. They claimed records were incomplete. Staff had changed. Memories had faded. But internal emails obtained later showed something else entirely. Leaders discussing containment within days of the death. Former clergy later explained the phrase. Pastoral resolution was code. It meant no police, no external documentation, no mandatory reporters informed. It meant the church decided the ending. The victims' parents didn't learn everything at once. They learned in fragments. A document here. A name there. A date that didn't line up. By the time they understood what may have happened, years had passed. Evidence was gone. Witnesses had moved. The statute of limitations loomed. That wasn't accidental. Up until now, the scandal was framed as abuse. Horrific, but civil. This death reframed everything. Because if church officials knowingly prevented investigation into a minor's death, that crossed into criminal conspiracy. And suddenly, prosecutors were paying attention. In early 2025, a state grand jury quietly subpoenaed diocesan records. Not because of pressure. Not because of media outrage. But because the paper trail was undeniable. Someone had made decisions that belonged to the state. And they'd done it behind closed doors. But the death wasn't the only one buried in the files. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered this case wasn't isolated. It was part of a pattern spanning decades and dioceses. Investigators weren't looking for a pattern. They were looking for one explanation. Instead, they found a system, built quietly, repeated deliberately, and hidden in plain sight. When the state grand jury subpoena arrived in early 2025, it wasn't broad. It was precise. They asked for internal correspondence tied to 3 priests, records of disciplinary actions labeled pastoral, any files referencing unexplained deaths or medical incidents involving minors. Church attorneys expected to manage the response. What they didn't expect was how much existed. Buried beneath digitized personnel files was a separate classification system. Not public-facing. Not even widely known internally. Folders marked with a single letter. R. Former administrators would later testify that R stood for restricted. These files were never meant to leave the building. Inside were documents that told a very different story than public church statements. They included complaints acknowledged but never reported, legal advice memos warning of criminal exposure, instructions on transferring priests before escalation, notes about families being offered support contingent on silence. Most disturbing of all, cross-references, names linked across years, across states, across dioceses. Investigators noticed something chilling. Different officials, different decades, but the language was nearly identical. Phrases like, minimize external risk, protect the faithful from scandal, resolve without civil involvement. This wasn't coincidence. It was policy, unwritten but enforced. By mapping the transfers, investigators saw how abuse traveled. A priest removed quietly in one state appeared months later in another, often in roles with youth access, counseling authority, minimal oversight. Each move reset the clock. Each new parish was a clean slate, for the institution, not the victims. What began as testimonies became numbers. Dozens of complaints, multiple unexplained deaths or medical crises, hundreds of internal communications. This wasn't a collection of bad decisions. It was infrastructure. One assistant prosecutor reportedly said, "This isn't failure to act. This is design." Because negligence is sporadic. Design is consistent. And consistency means intent. Internal emails revealed diocesan lawyers were involved early, often immediately after complaints. Their role wasn't to protect victims. It was to assess risk, anticipate subpoenas, keep matters ecclesiastical. In some cases, they explicitly advised against contacting law enforcement. That advice would later become central to the criminal inquiry. As names emerged, survivors began connecting dots for the first time. Different towns, different ages, same priest. Some had blamed themselves for years. Now they realized they were never alone. The isolation that kept them silent was manufactured. Abuse cases often collapse under time. Witnesses fade. Memories blur. Evidence disappears. But documents don't forget. And what these files showed was not just what happened, but what was prevented from happening. Justice. As the scope became clear, church leadership changed tone. They stopped denying. They started reframing. Words like historical failures, regret, cultural blind spots. But they still avoided the one word prosecutors cared about: accountability. A grand juror reportedly asked a simple question: if this wasn't intentional, why does it look so organized? There was no answer. But the most explosive revelation hadn't surfaced yet. Because buried in the R files was proof that church officials knew, in real time, that someone could die. And chose silence anyway. Stories feel better when shared. Subscribe to Coziness Stories and join a space made for quiet moments and deep stories. Silence didn't just protect reputations. It protected timelines. It protected people. And in at least one case, prosecutors would later argue, silence protected a killer. Among thousands of subpoenaed records, one internal email stopped investigators cold. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was strategic. Sent from a senior diocesan official to legal counsel, the message read, "We are aware of the risk. Involving outside authorities increases exposure. Best course remains internal resolution." The date mattered. It was sent after the death. Up until now, church attorneys argued ignorance. They claimed incomplete information, miscommunication, outdated policies. This email shattered that defense. Because it acknowledged risk and chose silence anyway. That wasn't a mistake. That was a decision. In U.S. law, there's a crucial distinction. Failing to report is one crime. Conspiring to conceal is another. This email suggested coordination, which meant obstruction, conspiracy, potential racketeering depending on scope. For the first time, prosecutors weren't just building cases against individuals. They were examining the institution itself. Church officials repeatedly invoked pastoral care as justification. They argued, victims needed privacy. Families wanted discretion. Public trials would cause further harm. But internal notes told a different story. They focused on media exposure, donor reactions, legal liability. The concern wasn't healing. It was containment. One survivor refused the usual path. When offered counseling and financial support, with a confidentiality clause, they said no. Instead, they asked one question. Why wasn't the police ever called? There was no answer. So the survivor called them. That call triggered a mandatory reporting cascade. Once law enforcement was notified, other agencies followed. Child Protective Services, state medical examiners, federal investigators reviewing interstate transfers. What the church had avoided for decades happened in weeks. Oversight. As pressure mounted, leadership issued carefully worded statements. They admitted errors in judgment, failures of process, but they denied intent, coordination, criminal behavior. Internally, however, emails showed panic. Phrases like exposure risk escalating, document retention concerns, prepare for testimony. Silence was no longer an option. The subpoena had an unintended effect. Retired clergy, no longer bound by career consequences, began cooperating. Some admitted. They were told not to document certain complaints. They were advised to leave details vague. They were warned against contacting authorities. What had once been whispered became sworn testimony. Prosecutors don't need motive. They need intent. And intent was evident in repeated decisions, consistent language, coordinated responses. This wasn't chaos. It was control. In a closed-door session, the victim's family was allowed to hear excerpts from internal communications. They didn't cry. They didn't shout. They asked one question. If you knew there was danger, why didn't you stop it? No one answered. Abuse is often prosecuted case by case. Cover-ups are prosecuted as systems. This chapter marks the moment investigators stopped asking what happened and started asking who allowed it to continue. But silence wasn't just institutional. It was enforced through pressure, fear, and money. And in the next chapter, investigators uncover how settlements became tools of control. Not every victim was offered money. Some were offered something else. A warning. And sometimes that warning was enough to last a lifetime. There are no transcripts of the phone calls. No emails. No official letters. Because intimidation works best when it leaves no paper trail. Former parishioners would later describe receiving calls late at night from numbers they didn't recognize. The voices were calm, polite, pastoral. But the message underneath was unmistakable. Think carefully about what you're saying. This could hurt your family. Once something is public, you can't take it back. It wasn't always clergy. Sometimes it was a diocesan liaison, a church-affiliated attorney, a respected community member acting on behalf of the church. That distance mattered. It allowed leadership to deny direct involvement while the pressure still landed. Most intimidation wasn't violent. It was strategic. Survivors were reminded of their jobs, their immigration status, their children's schools, their family's reputation in the community. Nothing illegal was said. Nothing explicit. But everything was understood. One survivor, now in their 40s, testified before the grand jury. They described walking into a police station years earlier, ready to report abuse. Before they could file paperwork, they received a call. Someone knew where they were. The message was simple. You don't need to do this. They left and never returned. In small towns, the church wasn't just a place of worship. It was social center, employer, moral authority. Speaking out meant isolation. Some survivors were told directly, "You'll destroy the parish. You'll hurt innocent people. Why reopen old wounds?" The burden of silence was placed on the victim, not the abuser. For deeply religious families, intimidation took a different form. Survivors were reminded of forgiveness, sin, obedience. They were told, "God will judge this. You don't need earthly justice." Faith became a weapon, turned inward. Because intimidation wasn't documented, the church later claimed ignorance. They said, "We never discouraged reporting. We always supported victims." But patterns don't require paperwork. They require repetition. And repetition was everywhere. The same administrator from earlier chapters testified they overheard conversations in hallways. Officials discussing which families were safe, which were volatile, which needed extra care. Extra care didn't mean help. It meant monitoring. For years, intimidation worked. Until it didn't. Because the same tactics that silenced individuals couldn't silence numbers. As more survivors connected, the fear shifted. Isolation broke. And something new replaced it. Anger. Support groups formed quietly. Not under church guidance. Not publicly. Survivors compared experiences. Different states. Different decades. Same warnings. Same language. Same outcomes. That's when they realized intimidation wasn't random. It was policy, unwritten but enforced. You can hide payments. You can bury files. But intimidation reveals intent. Because silence enforced through fear is no longer passive. It's active harm. And prosecutors don't ignore that. But fear didn't just silence survivors. It also silenced clergy who wanted to speak. And in the next chapter, one priest finally does. For decades, the church relied on one certainty. Priests don't testify against priests. Until one did. He wasn't a rebel. He wasn't outspoken. He wasn't on anyone's radar. Father Michael, name changed for safety reasons, had served quietly for over 30 years. No scandals. No complaints. No ambition. Which is why, when investigators received a message requesting a confidential meeting from a Catholic priest, they didn't believe it at first. Then they read the subject line. "I was told to stay quiet. I can't anymore." Father Michael hadn't abused anyone. That's what made his testimony so dangerous. He had sat in meetings, read internal correspondence, been instructed to avoid details in parish reports. He had witnessed transfers happen overnight, without explanation. And he had been told explicitly more than once. This is not something we take outside the church. In 2001, Father Michael attended a closed diocesan meeting. The topic wasn't abuse. It was risk. Lawyers spoke more than clergy. One official asked, "What happens if police get involved?" The answer chilled him. "Then we lose control. Not justice. Not truth. Control." Years later, after hearing rumors of a teen's death tied to clergy misconduct, Father Michael considered reporting it. He consulted a senior priest he trusted. The response was immediate. "If you do that, your ministry is over. No threat of punishment. Just exile." For a man whose entire identity was service, that was enough. Father Michael carried it quietly. Every sermon on truth. Every confession heard. Every funeral for a young parishioner. The weight didn't fade. It grew. The 2025 investigation made headlines. Grand juries. Subpoenas. Survivors speaking publicly. Then Father Michael recognized a name in a leaked document. A boy he'd once taught. A boy he remembered laughing. A boy listed as deceased. He realized silence hadn't preserved the church. It had destroyed lives. Father Michael didn't call a reporter. He didn't go public. He contacted investigators directly. Requested immunity, not for crimes, but for violating church confidentiality. What he offered instead was testimony. Under sworn questioning, Father Michael confirmed. Abuse complaints were discussed internally. Law enforcement was intentionally excluded. Transfers were used to reset exposure. Deaths were framed as pastoral matters, not legal ones. Most importantly, he testified this wasn't rare. It was normal. Within days of his testimony, He was removed from public ministry. His parish assignment was suspended. A statement cited health reasons. No accusations. No denials. Just disappearance. Survivors could be dismissed as emotional. Documents could be challenged as incomplete. But a priest, under oath, confirming intent? That changed everything. Because he didn't just say what happened. He said why. One prosecutor later stated, that testimony connected every piece. It explained the silence, the payments, the intimidation. It showed design, not disorder. But breaking ranks came with consequences. Because once one priest spoke, others were forced to choose. The church thought one priest speaking was manageable. An anomaly. A problem to isolate. They didn't realize he'd already set something in motion. Because silence only survives when everyone agrees to keep it. And now, someone had broken the agreement. 3 days after Father Michael testified, investigators received another message. Then another. Then another. Not from victims this time. From clergy. Some retired. Some still active. Some terrified. Each said the same thing in different words. I thought I was the only one who knew. What followed wasn't a flood, it was a drip. But drips add up. Former priests began confirming. Meetings where abuse was discussed without reporting. Legal counsel advising against police involvement. Instructions to destroy handwritten notes after summaries were filed. Individually, each account was disturbing. Together they were damning. Leadership moved fast. Emergency meetings were called. Statements were drafted. Attorneys were activated. Internally, language shifted from denial to damage control. Emails obtained by investigators used phrases like, contain narrative, limit testimonial exposure, prepare for coordinated defense. This wasn't about truth anymore. It was about survival. A journalist broke the story of the restricted archives. The term "our files" went public. Suddenly, the church's internal classification system was common knowledge. Survivors recognized the language immediately. They'd seen it before, on documents they were never supposed to read. Group filings began appearing in multiple states. Not individual lawsuits. Collective action. Survivors coordinated. Timelines. Priest assignments. Complaint histories. Patterns became impossible to dismiss. This wasn't coincidence. It was recurrence. What began as a state investigation widened. Federal agencies reviewed. Interstate transfers. Financial flows. Potential racketeering violations. The question wasn't just who committed abuse. It was who facilitated it across state lines. Defense attorneys advanced a familiar claim. These actions were consistent with the norms of the time. Prosecutors were ready. They presented documents showing mandatory reporting laws already in place, explicit warnings from legal counsel, internal acknowledgement of criminal risk. This wasn't ignorance of modern standards. It was disregard for existing law. In a rare statement, a grand juror addressed the court. This investigation revealed an organization that chose secrecy over safety, again and again. The words echoed beyond the courtroom. They appeared in headlines. And for the first time the narrative shifted. Because once intent was established, everything connected. Abuse led to silence. Silence led to transfers. Transfers led to more victims. And concealment led to death. Each decision built on the last. For decades, leadership had shaped public understanding. Now, survivors did. Their stories weren't isolated anymore. They were chapters in the same book. But the most powerful moment hadn't happened yet. Because someone the church never expected to hear from, finally spoke publicly. You're listening to Coziness Stories. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story waiting for you. For decades, the church controlled the narrative. Victims were isolated. Families were silenced. Until one family decided silence was no longer an option, even if it meant standing alone against an institution that had never lost a war like this before. It began with a letter. Not to police. Not to a lawyer. But to the diocese itself. The parents of a young altar server, who died by suicide years earlier, had finally obtained their son's sealed counseling records. Inside was a name they recognized immediately. A priest. One who had been quietly reassigned months before their son's death. No one had ever told them why. The family requested a meeting with church officials. They were polite. Calm. Measured. They didn't accuse. They asked, why was the priest moved? Who approved the transfer? Why wasn't law enforcement contacted? The answers came slowly, if at all. And every response raised more questions than it answered. During the third meeting, A diocesan representative said something offhandedly. At the time, we believed counseling would be sufficient. That sentence shattered the room. Because it confirmed what the family had feared. The church knew. And chose not to act. The family didn't want attention. They wanted accountability. But when their requests were ignored, they did what victims before them were warned never to do. They spoke to the press. Within 48 hours, the story went national. A grieving mother holding her son's photo. A father reading from a letter that had never been answered. And one devastating line that stopped people cold. If someone had made one phone call, my son might still be alive. After the interview aired, the family's phone didn't stop ringing. Other parents. Former altar servers. Relatives of victims who never lived long enough to speak. They weren't calling journalists. They were calling the family. Because for the first time, someone like them had been heard. A whistleblower, still anonymous, sent the family a document. An internal memo. Listed. Names of priests under restricted supervision. Dates of allegations. Transfer destinations. Explicit instructions. Avoid external reporting. One name stood out. The priest linked to their son. When the family handed the memo to investigators, the tone shifted immediately. This wasn't testimony. This was paper. Dated. Signed. Proved. The memo proved something critical. This wasn't negligence. It was policy. During a pretrial hearing, the mother was allowed to speak. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She said one sentence. You protected a system. We buried a child. The courtroom went silent. Even the defense looked down. They weren't activists. They weren't lawyers. They weren't seeking money. They were parents who refused to let their child become a footnote. And that made them impossible to dismiss. Behind closed doors, officials acknowledged the damage. Internal communications described the situation as uncontainable, narratively irreversible, a generational reckoning. For the first time, leadership realized something terrifying. The story no longer belonged to them. But the most dangerous truth was still hidden. Because buried inside the archives was evidence that connected abuse to something even darker. A death the church never explained. For years the church said there was no proof. No pattern. No cover-up. But in 2025, one sealed file, one overlooked death, and one internal decision exposed a truth so devastating that even the institution built on silence could no longer contain it. This wasn't just abuse. This was concealment after death. It was buried deep in diocesan archives. Not digitized. Not indexed. Not meant to be found. A case file stamped resolved, no further action required. Inside, a death certificate, a short internal summary, and a handwritten note in red ink. Do not reopen unless compelled. That note would become the church's undoing. The victim was a teenage altar server. Found dead in his bedroom. Ruled a suicide. No note. No prior mental health diagnosis. His parents had always felt something was wrong. But they were told, firmly, that questioning the ruling would only prolong their grief. In 2025, independent forensic analysts reviewed the file. One detail stood out. The estimated time of death didn't match witness statements. Another detail followed. The priest assigned to the teen's parish had been transferred 3 days earlier. No explanation. No announcement. No documentation sent to police. Then came the email. Recovered from a retired administrator's old server. Subject line, urgent, before the weekend. The message read, if this becomes public, the implications will be catastrophic. Move father immediately. Ensure the family accepts the conclusion. There was no ambiguity. This wasn't confusion. This was coordination. Once the email surfaced, prosecutors had no choice. The case was reopened. Not as a suicide, but as a death linked to institutional obstruction. Subpoenas followed. So did indictments. In a press conference that shook the country, the district attorney said, "We are no longer investigating individual acts of abuse. We are investigating a system that chose reputation over human life." That sentence marked the end of an era. The priest connected to multiple cases was found dead months later. Natural causes. But the timing didn't matter. Because by then, the documents spoke louder than any confession. For the first time, mandatory reporting laws were rewritten. Statutes of limitation were extended. Internal church documents became admissible evidence. Survivors were no longer required to prove trauma. The system had proven it for them. The final ruling didn't come with handcuffs. It came with accountability. A federal judge ruled, This institution engaged in deliberate concealment that resulted in foreseeable harm. The church was ordered to release thousands of sealed records, some dating back over 60 years, for parents who had buried children, for survivors who had been told to forgive and forget, for those who were never believed. The truth wasn't healing, but it was freeing. The church still stands, but its power to control the narrative is gone. Because once the truth escaped the archives, it couldn't be locked away again. This story wasn't about faith, it was about power. And what happens when power is protected at the cost of human lives? The truth didn't disappear. It waited. And in 2025, it finally came out. Thank you for spending this moment with Coziness Stories. Subscribe, rest easy, and I'll see you in the next story.